A 30-ton refrigerated truck cuts through the sun-drenched rice fields of China's Yangtze River Delta. Below it, millions of bright red crawfish scuttle through flooded paddies. But this truck isn't carrying imported luxury goods. It's carrying a creature that was once a national ecological disaster, now turned into a $50 billion global industry that has stunned the whole of Europe. This is China's crawfish industry, and it is one of the most jaw-dropping economic and ecological turnarounds ever completed in Asia. Here are the numbers that will stop you in your tracks. It generates over $50 billion in annual economic output. It was built from a national disaster in less than 30 years. It makes up 95% of the entire world's crawfish production. And almost every single part of this global supply chain was built and mastered by one country, China. But before you ask how they did it, you need to understand why this turnaround was so impossible. Let's start from the very beginning. In the 1990s, China was facing an ecological nightmare that was strangling rural communities across the country. Every day, millions of invasive red swamp crawfish multiplied unchecked in rivers, lakes, and rice paddies. But here's the problem. These tiny creatures weren't just a curious new species. They were a disaster. They chewed through rice crop roots, burrowed through irrigation dams until they collapsed, and wiped out native fish and insect populations across thousands of square kilometers of farmland. Think about what that meant for rural China, where hundreds of millions of families relied on farming to survive. Rice farmers watched their entire year's harvest get destroyed overnight. Villagers saw their irrigation systems ruined with no way to water their crops. Fishermen came back with empty nets, their livelihoods wiped out by an invasive species with no natural predators. The whole rural economy in some regions was on the brink of collapse, all because of a 10-centimeter long crustacean that no one knew how to stop. China's rural communities needed something bold, something that would turn this unstoppable disaster into an opportunity, not a death sentence. In 2001, a team of Chinese aquaculture scientists working alongside rice farmers in Xinjiang, Hubei province, unveiled a plan that was almost impossible to believe at the time. Using decades of ecological research, centimeter-precise satellite mapping of water systems, and lab testing of crawfish breeding cycles, they designed a system that worked with nature, not against it. They mapped every inch of the rice paddies, tested soil and water quality down to the milligram, and engineered a breeding cycle that aligned perfectly with the rice growing season. The goal was simple on paper, but almost unbelievable in reality. Turn a destructive invasive species into a sustainable multi-billion-dollar industry in under 20 years, not just to eliminate the disaster, but to lift millions of rural families out of poverty and build a global supply chain that would dominate the world. Before a single crawfish could be sold to a restaurant, before a single farmer could earn a single yuan from this species, scientists and farmers had to deal with one of the biggest, most invisible challenges of the entire project. The first battle wasn't against the crawfish's massive numbers. It was against their very nature. Crawfish are hardwired to burrow, to chew through plant roots, and to reproduce so fast they overwhelm any ecosystem. Putting them in a rice paddy should have been a recipe for even more disaster. Farmers needed a way to make the crawfish and the rice not just coexist, but thrive together. To solve this, engineers and farmers used a clever, surprisingly simple trick that rewrote the rules of farming. They aligned the crawfish's breeding and feeding cycle perfectly with the rice's growing schedule, like a baker timing every step of making a layer cake to have every component ready at the exact same moment. When the rice seedlings are first planted and too fragile to handle crawfish, the young crustaceans are kept in separate shallow trenches around the paddy. As the rice grows taller and develops strong roots, the water level rises, letting the crawfish move into the main paddy. There, they eat the insects and weeds that would normally kill the rice, and their waste acts as a natural, nutrient-rich fertilizer for the crops, like adding perfectly balanced plant food to your houseplants, no harsh chemicals needed. Now, here is the part that will genuinely make your jaw drop. What started as a 50-acre test plot in a single village in Xianjiang has exploded into a nationwide industry that covers over 20 million acres of farmland. To put that in perspective, that's more farmland than the entire country of Belgium uses for all of its agriculture combined. Every year, China produces over 2.8 million tons of crawfish. That's enough to fill 14,000 20-ton shipping containers. Lined up end to end, those containers would stretch from Beijing all the way to Paris. The industry now employs over 5.2 million people across the country. That's more than the entire population of Norway. But the real magic isn't just in the mind-blowing scale. It's in the micro details that let Chinese crawfish take over European dinner tables, fresh and perfect, every single time. Those bright red pre-cooked crawfish you buy in a European supermarket don't come straight from a rice paddy. They start their journey at 4 a.m. when farmers harvest them at the peak of freshness, when their meat is the most tender and sweet. Within 2 hours, they're washed, sorted, and cooked in a precision 100 degrees Celsius steam bath like a perfectly timed sous vide cook for a 5-star restaurant, locking in all the flavor and juiciness without overcooking. Then they're flash frozen in 30 seconds at minus 40 degrees Celsius, a process that stops bacterial growth dead in its tracks, like hitting pause on a movie. So the crawfish tastes exactly as fresh as the day it was harvested when it's thawed 6 months later in a kitchen in London or Paris. Every single crawfish is inspected by hand and by AI-powered cameras, checking for size, quality, and even the brightness of their red shells, like a fashion designer inspecting every stitch on a luxury dress, to make sure only the very best make it to the final product. The entire process, from harvest to being loaded onto a plane bound for Europe, takes less than 12 hours. That's faster than it takes to ship a package from one end of Europe to the other. When the first batch of farm-raised Chinese crawfish hit restaurant tables in 2003, a single farmer could earn around $200 extra a year from their rice paddy. Before that, that same farmer would lose thousands of dollars a year from crawfish destroying their crops. That is not a small improvement. That is a complete reversal of fortune for millions of rural families. The numbers tell the full story. What was once an ecological disaster that destroyed thousands of acres of farmland every year is now a sustainable farming system that cuts pesticide use by 70% and fertilizer use by 50%, while doubling a farmer's income per acre of land. In 2023, China exported over 120,000 tons of crawfish to Europe, making up 72% of all crawfish sold in European supermarkets and restaurants. Remember the rice farmers who watched their harvest get destroyed overnight? This is what the industry means for them. A farmer in Zhenjiang can now earn over $15,000 a year from a single 10-acre rice paddy, more than 3 times the average rural income in China. Young people who left their villages for city jobs are moving back home to start crawfish farms, restaurants, and processing factories, reviving dying rural towns. A single mother in Hubei can now run a small crawfish processing business from her village, earning enough to send her kids to university, something that would have been impossible 20 years ago. This industry didn't just turn a disaster into a product. It lifted millions of people out of poverty and rewrote the future of rural China. Is the industry perfect? No. Its rapid growth has come with real challenges. In the early years, some unregulated farms cut corners on food safety, and overcrowded crawfish ponds in some regions have caused local water pollution. European regulators have also put strict import rules in place, forcing the industry to constantly raise its standards. But in terms of the scale of the turnaround, the way it turned an existential ecological disaster into a force for poverty alleviation and sustainable farming, it stands as one of the most remarkable economic and environmental feats of the 21st century. If you made it this far, you just took a journey through one of the most ambitious economic and ecological turnarounds in modern history. You learned how a country turned a devastating invasive species into a global superpower and lifted millions of people out of poverty along the way, all without sitting through a single boring biology lecture. That is what this channel is all about, breaking down the world's most incredible stories of human ingenuity in a way that makes you feel like you're right there, watching history unfold. If that sounds like your kind of content, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our next deep dive. If you could turn one invasive species or environmental disaster into a thriving industry anywhere in the world, what would it be and how would you do it? Drop your answer in the comments below.